All right, so hi, my name is Alex. I'll be talking about UI components today, and as a case study, UI components at Adapar and our open source libraries. And I just wanted to start off by saying welcome. So since I work here at Adapar, I'm really happy to see so many of you here. I'm delighted that there is a huge turnout. So thanks everyone for coming. And I thought I'd also use the first couple minutes of my talk to introduce Adapar. Since I think a lot of people don't have a good idea of what Addepar really does, haven't seen Addepar software. I've heard a while ago, so Addepar has been using Ember since before 1.0, and I heard that a few people even thought we were a consulting company because they have never seen our product. So I just want to take a minute and just show you Addepar's product. And so the first thing to say is that Addepar is a company that makes software for investment managers. So this is something that might be used by the manager of a 401k fund or your endowment fund. And anyway, so these are people who manage a lot of money for a lot of people. They might be managing some of your assets someday, maybe through your university. And so the problems that we are solving are kind of, here's a lot of data, how do we display it to the user in a way that's really simple? And how do we enable them to make better decisions and tell their clients what they've been doing? So here's one of the main interfaces of Addepar. This is one of the analysis panes, and you don't really need to look too deeply, but in the middle there's a big table, and it kind of shows like a grouped list of what you own, and then there's a column on the right with the value, and you can put all kinds of crazy configurable columns and analysis there. On the right there are charts that can help you do some quick analysis. And so for example, one of the things you can do with this tool is quickly kind of look into things that you want to find out. So like, for example, I'm going to configure this chart to be a time series chart. What's that? Oh, okay. All right. So we can just quickly measure, for example, a measure of how well our firm is doing called TWR against something like benchmark. Which is just a measure of kind of how the industry is doing. And so you can just add both of those on the same chart real quick. And here it is. And so here we have our firm's performance on the bottom and industry performance on the top. And you can see that our firm isn't doing all that well, apparently. Luckily, it's just a demo firm. So the idea is that you can kind of like come and dig into your data really fast and get some insights and then share them with your clients. So let's say, we've looked at this graph and we're like, hey, this is really great. I'm going to tell all my clients about this. And so we can go into our Addepar's report editor, which is kind of like it's a WYSIWYG editor. So this kind of looks like PowerPoint, hopefully, to you. And we can toss in a few widgets. So like, let's just toss in a table. Oh, that's okay. Table, chart. We can toss in a text box. We can put in some user-specific information. So, hello, your value is value. And that populates with data. And so this is really nice. We can do this and we can publish it to PDF and share it. And it can take you a couple minutes to make a really sophisticated looking report. And then the real power of this also is that we can go and just go ahead and change the context. So say I'm managing money for a lot of people at once. I can go ahead and just change the context of the report to someone else, and it'll populate with their data. And so we can go ahead and publish, the same report for all of our clients all at once. And so this kind of process used to take a very long time, and Adapar makes it very easy. So that's my like real quick 2-minute demo of Adapar. And so now I kind of want to just look again at what I've showed you already and identify some things that are like components throughout the app, because I'm going to focus on UI components in my talk. And so here we have a table. Back in the analysis screen, there was also a table. It would be nice if we could use the same base class for both of those. So we don't have to redo all the logic, even if they're a little bit different. The chart is exactly the same in one place and another. And even the text box here is a widget that we can break out into a component and reuse in different places in our app. And so that's kind of the value is, we can use the same chart in 2 very different places in our app, and that helps reduce code duplication. It helps with a lot of things. Right. So yeah, so I'm going to talk kind of about component libraries. So these are isolated parts of your app, something like a date picker or a select or a table. And the idea is that I'm just talking about UI libraries. So these are kind of drop-in things you can put into your app, kind of like the YouTube plugin that Jay showed in the last talk. And so this is kind of my main part of the talk. So my goal is I'm going to show off Adapar is open source and kind of try to convince you that components are great. You should use them a lot. You should publish your own open source plugins. They're really powerful. I'm going to discuss, as I do that, I'm going to discuss a couple of choices you have to make when making components. And all at the same time, we're going to build a little personal finance tool, kind of like mint.com, but not as functional. And so without further ado, here's the libraries we're going to use. So these are the Addepar's 3 open source libraries. There's charts, table, and widgets. And so charts and table are pretty self-explanatory. Table is really nice because it can display 100,000 elements and it only renders the ones on the screen. And then the widgets library is kind of a collection of handy little things you can use around your app. So like there's a color chooser there. I could imagine a date picker would be a widget. So we're going to use all 3 of these. And we're going to make a little app called Minipar using all of Addepar's tools. And we're off to a good start because it has a logo already. So, I mean, really, that's the most important thing. So we're going to use also Ember CLI. So the last talk was a really good primer. So we're going to use this Ember new command to generate an app. And then let's go ahead and take a look at the code and see what happens. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and Ember serve. And then we're going to go look at the structure of the app here. So pro tip is something I like to do whenever I start an Ember CLI project is have a couple pre-existing commits that pull in all your dependencies and set up the scaffolding. It's really convenient. So I've done that with this app. And so we can go check it out. And this is what it looks like. So I've basically just kind of set up a template for the app of where I want things to be. And I pulled in all of Adepar's open source libraries. And so I just want to kind of walk you through the things that I've done. So I ran Ember new, I got an Ember CLI app here, and I added some things to it, but not very much. So let me just walk through those. So there's a build file here called the Brock file. And with that, I just imported all the dependencies just using app.import one by one. So this is Adepar's libraries at the bottom, and then all of our libraries dependencies at the top. So there's that. I can go into the app folder. And so I brought in a bunch of data. So this is transactions.js, and it's just a big list JSON of a bunch of objects. And so each object is like a transaction. So it has a date, a description, a category, and an amount. I went and set up the controller to process all the data. So it just kind of rearranges the data. It doesn't do anything very fancy. So it's how long? 59 lines of code. And then I set up some styles and imported a font. And that's also pretty simple. I just, a few rules here just to kind of do the positioning. And then I have used like 5 aesthetic rules at the bottom. And besides that, we're gonna do everything in the handlebars file. And I'm mostly gonna focus on just kind of like the API of each component we use and why we do it that way. So the first thing we're gonna do is make a table component. So let's go back to our app. We're gonna put the table on the right side. And the dependency is already imported. So in the handlebars, I'm just going to do it like this. Okay. Table component has footer is false. You can just configure it. We're going to bind a property called columns. This is something you would have to go look up at the documentation to see, oh, I need to bind a columns property. And the content property is the transactions. And so I've already backed up this with data back in the application controller. And basically all I have to do is here's a transactions property that wraps that big list of transactions. And then I exported a few column configurations, which is what Ember table expects. So we can go back to our app now. And here's the table. So this is kind of how Ember components are supposed to work, is you drop them in, they render themselves really nicely, they look good. And so here we have a table with all my transactions. It scrolls itself really well. And And in the new Ember CLI, you'll be able to install stuff like this just with Ember install add-on, which is like a one-line command, and you can pretty much already start using it. So that's really cool. So I want to talk a little bit, take a little detour into component design here. And so the question is, I have a list of transactions here, and each of them has a different category. So some are restaurants, some are groceries. What if I wanted to create a filter to show maybe like only the ones that are restaurants? The question is, where do I put that filtering logic? So I think there are kind of two ways to do this. So we can either, on the left, we do all the filtering outside of the component. So we already had a list of transactions. We can just write a computed property that goes through them and only leaves the ones that match the property we want, and then we pass that filtered list into the component. So that's way number one. And the second way is that we can pass the filter text and the full list into the component, and the component figures out what to do. And so this is kind of a decision you'll have to make as you build components. But I think it's often nice to prefer the second way, the one where you pass everything in and the component takes care of itself, because it kind of helps you be modular in your code. It helps you kind of think, oh, the component's just going to do its own thing. I only have to worry about getting the thing to filter by and then giving it to the component. It'll take care of itself. And if that gets too complex, you want to start extending. So you don't have to put this all in the base table component that you've written. You can do table component.extend and then do all the filtering stuff you want. And now this is defined as another Ember component. So components can define each other, can extend each other. They can build on what the base component has. And for example, at Adapar, we do this a lot. We do this, we extend components a lot at Adapar. We have a lot of internal components, as well as the ones we have in our open source libraries. And so here, one example here is I showed you before there was a table both in the analysis pane and in the report pane. And the report one actually does this crazy thing. It overrides the render function in the component, which basically says it doesn't want the open source Ember table to do anything at all. It's just going to take care of its own rendering. But since we extend the table component, we still get to use a lot of the behaviors like how columns are configured and how columns work. So it's nice to just extend things a lot, extend components a lot, and put in the new behavior you need. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go back and let's do the edit pane next. So the idea of this little edit block is we want it so that if we go and click on one of the rows in our table, then we can edit some of the properties of that row. So we're going to do this using Ember input helpers and using one of our Ember widgets called the select component. So let's head back to our handlebars file, and I've made some space for the edit pane already. This is a bit of a lot of things just because there's two input helpers, so I'll just paste it in. Okay, so here we see there's two input helpers. So these will just help us grab text. And then here we have a select component. And so the select component is an Ember widget. And basically what we do with this is we pass it a selection. And it'll give us a drop down to let us choose between everything in that, and it'll set selection to the result of whatever you chose. So here we have categories is the content of the component, so it'll let us pick between everything that's down to the category's name, and it'll set the result to something in selected transaction. So all of these things, what we're going to do basically is we're going to have the table define what's the selected transaction. So when you click in the table, that'll bind the property selected transaction back into the application. And then we're going to do another binding over here in the components that lets us edit those properties. So I haven't actually added that to the table yet, so I have to do that. So back here, I'm editing the table component now, so I'm binding selection to selected transaction. And so right now everything is bound together. So that's really good. So let me just go show you how it works. So here's our edit panel that we made. Nothing's filled in right now, but if we click a row here, Ember Tables API has selected the row and bound that back to selected transaction. And then selected transaction dot category got bound into the select component. So everything's tied together right now, which means that here, if we edit this from restaurants over to groceries, that'll update it in the table. It'll update it everywhere. Everything's bound all the way through. And so that's the idea of data binding and why it can be so useful, and how you bind data into components and get it back out. And so this is also an example of something called two-way data binding. And so again, this is kind of the essence of what we did here. We have our table component, and we bound whatever you selected to a property called selected transaction. And the table component takes care of that. And then in our select component, we bound the select component's selection property to selected transaction.category. And so when that's tied together, edits you made to want, so the selection will propagate through your app. So this is two-way binding, and two-way binding is great while your app is simple. It's nice. You can see like we were able to do that in not very much code, and it works really well. Two-way binding is not so great once your app gets really complex. So I want to give you a couple of examples in which the way I did this just now is going to start to break down. So example number one is when we have a selected row in the table. The way we did it was we said the table is going to manage its selected row. So when you click it, that'll kind of propagate back out of the table. But that's kind of internal table state. So if we let that be bound back out of the table and we let other components touch it, what happens when we bind the same thing to 10 different components, and each one of them makes an edit to that property and it propagates through our app. It's difficult to trace causes of errors in that case because we don't know what touched it, what did what, and also it's kind of internal table state. The table wasn't really expecting somebody else to change it, and so there isn't really this idea of who owns the property. A second example of why two-way binding can be a problem is if we have invalid input. So let's go back to our app for a sec. We noticed that, and I've actually used strings for everything here just for simplicity's sake. But here we have an amount of money that we're supposed to be able to edit, and we can edit it to say like Apple. And the table's totally okay with that. It accepts it. It's like, oh yeah, that value is Apple. But that's obviously a problem because that's supposed to be money. And so the question is, at what point do we check that your input was valid? If we check it, right here in the input component, then we're losing the value of that immediate binding because you can't bind. You have to kind of like bind it through a checker, and then the result of that would get bound to something else. So that's complicated. If we check it in the table, and so maybe we don't do that. Maybe we say, oh, you just submit what you want, and then anybody who uses this thing will check it to see whether it's valid. And then you're going to get a case where the table checks it and it says, oh, Apple isn't valid. Let's change it back. And then you have this like everyone's changing the thing back and forth until it's right. So both of these kind of don't scale to large numbers of components. And so that's why Ember is kind of moving away from two-way binding, at least by default. That you should at least know what you're doing if you're two-way binding. So instead what you should think maybe is ask, don't tell. And so this is kind of a guiding principle. So let's say that selected row is like something the table needs to keep track of or needs to know. So we can bind that in just like I did selection equals selected row. Now we've told the table what it can do. The table shouldn't tell the application what selected row is without getting the application's permission. So we add another thing. We add an action called update selection. So now the table can call update selection and kind of ask the application to update that property, and the application can do its validity checking, and that's kind of the place that everybody goes to update that property. And so data down, that means if the component needs data, we're passing it in, and actions up. We use actions to propagate data back up to the application. So there's another kind of principle of component design and something you should think about when you start designing a lot of components and have a lot of APIs there. So that's my edit pane. And next we're going to go and finish our app by making the chart. The chart is the simplest in terms of handlebars. I did a little bit of work on the back end. All I had to do is kind of get a unique list of categories and then go through the list of transactions and filter them by category and add them all up. And the goal is to get like a pie chart that shows I've spent this much on groceries, this much on restaurants, and stuff like that. So in terms of handlebars, we just use the component called pie chart. Data equals myself. I call it pie data. Pie data. And so again here we've bound the pie chart's data property to the application's pie data property. We come back here, and here we're displaying a pie chart. So this is pretty cool. And this is an example of the component doing it the right way, in that we've done data down, we passed the data into the chart's now taking care of itself and does all the rendering that we needed. So I want to talk now about another principle of component design, which is API consistency. So take a look at these three kinds of charts. They kind of have a lot in common. They all display the same things. So they would all take the same kind of data, and they all display it in kind of the same way. So there's like the pie chart and the two different bar charts. They each give you kind of an idea of how much one thing compares to the other thing. So maybe this should be, maybe we should do something about that. So here's the first element of API consistency. This is how you use all three of these components. And right now in our library, they're all different components. So in each one, you can pass data equals content, and you can pass them all the same kind of data. You pass them like kind of a list of groupings. So that's one way to do it. And that's the first part, is like, it's good that they all use the same kind of data and they use it in the same way. But maybe we could do better. So here's kind of two examples of ways we could do it better. We could unite the both bar charts into one bar chart and have a property called orientation. Or we could maybe even unite all three charts into one chart and have a property called type. And the idea would be that then you could tell the component, this is your type, this is your orientation, and then the component will adjust itself. And that has a couple of advantages. For one, you're not maintaining two different components, so maybe you're actually going to repeat less code. And also it allows you to easily switch between types. So rather than swapping out the components, you can just change the type, and the component should do its own thing and update. And so that's the end of our little mini par, and it's pretty cool. I mean, you can do some neat stuff. So for example, here's a restaurants thing. Let's change it to groceries. Let's update its cost, and as we update, the chart updates, and so now groceries have taken over the pie chart now that I've made this $100,000. So it's kind of cool that everything's bound. It's very easy to bind everything together like this. And yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. So thank you. And big thanks to the Adapar team, to my team, and to our hosts. While we're on the topic, we're hiring. Come find us after, or email us. And that's my contact and info. You can find the data or the code for this demo at GitHub. It's actually a pretty good way to start using Adapar components if you're interested in that. And my slides are online too.